Liberia in Latin means the land of the free. Liberia is located on the southern tip of West Africa. It is bordered by Sierra Leone to its west, Guinea to its north, and Ivory Coast to its east. In the early 1800s across the United States, the topic of slavery and the rights of black Americans was the hot topic everywhere. The American Colonization Society, ACS, was formed to figure out how to deal with the growing number of free blacks in America. The ACS thought the blacks would have a better chance of liberty in their own country versus America. The Quakers, members of the ACS, thought the free blacks would never have a chance of true freedom in America, while the Southern members of the ACS were selfish and just wanted to remove the blacks so that they did not organize slave rebellions. In the end, the U.S. decided to provide funding for free-born black and emancipated slaves to go to Liberia. In 1818, the ACS sent 2 representatives to West Africa to find a location. After arriving, they were unable to convince any of the tribal leaders to sell any territory. In 1820, the first black American settlers crossed the ocean, first arriving at Sierra Leone, and then eventually arriving at Cherbourg Island. Many of the first settlers died of malaria. A year later, a group tried again, and this time the Captain Robert Stockton was able to purchase a strip of land. The settlement was named Monrovia, after U.S. President James Monroe, who procured money for the project, and the colony became known as Liberia. Over the next years, other colonization societies sponsored by individual states continued to send settlers to areas near Monrovia. In 1838, most of the settlements merged into one group of about 20,000 people. The settlers tried to keep the culture that they brought from America. However, they did marry people of the existing societies in West Africa. In 1847, Liberia became a republic with a constitution and flag modeled after the United States. Liberia declared independence from the American Colonization Society in order to establish itself as a sovereign state and create its own laws governing commerce. The first president was Joseph Jenkins Robert, who was a free-born black from the state of Virginia. Roberts resolved to ensure that Liberia was based on justice and equal rights. England and France were the first 2 countries to recognize Liberia's independence. The current government of Liberia is similar to the United States in that it is comprised of executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The legislative branch of Liberia's government has both a Senate and a House of Representatives like the U.S. There are 15 counties, and each is represented by 2 senators for a total of 30 senators. The 64 seats within the House of Representatives are divided among the counties based upon population of the county, with a minimum of 2 representatives from each county. Each senator serves a 9-year term, and the representatives each serve 6-year terms. Liberia's leader is called the president, and can serve a total of 2 6-year terms in office, compared to the 4-year term served by the U.S. president. The remainder of the executive branch are the vice president and the cabinet. Again, similar to the United States, the highest judicial body in Liberia is the Supreme Court. It is comprised of 5 justices, nominated by the President. Each justice must be confirmed by the Senate, and their term of service is lifelong. In 2006, the country's current president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was elected. But Liberia's government was not always this way. Liberia's government in 1847 started similar to how it is now, which made Liberia the only free republic in Africa. That ended, however, with the First Republic in 1980. Things had been going downhill for Liberia. The ACS withdrew their support. Liberia tried to modernize its agricultural economy, but still failed to generate enough income to cover the costs of imports and loans. By 1909, the Liberian government was bankrupt and had to borrow money from the U.S. Having to find some source of revenue, Liberia signed deals with American companies which were not in Liberia's favor. Finally, in 1930, claims of forced labor, basically slavery, were found to be true. The government collapsed, and to fix this, the president introduced repressive laws. Over the years, the gap between the ruling class and the working class grew. In the 1940s, Liberia again saw a change in politics with President Tubman, who gradually became more authoritarian and even changed the time in office to allow himself to stay for 7 consecutive terms, forbid the press to publish, and put in place a network of spies to report on any political activity. Tubman died in 1971 and Tolbert took over as president. Liberia was not in a good state, and nothing that Tolbert did worked. In 1980, Samuel Doe, an indigenous master sergeant in the army, broke into the presidential mansion and shot Tolbert. The new government, called the People's Redemption Council, was led by Doe. At first people were happy, but over time support seemed to diminish as the power went to Dou's head. In 1985, Dou declared himself the winner of a presidential election that he actually had lost. This led to the government becoming more corrupt, which forced many people to flee across the border of the Ivory Coast. In December 1989, former government minister Charles Taylor moved into the Liberia to start an uprising in order to take down the Dou government. This led to a brutal civil war. The first Liberian civil war was from 1989 until 1997. The conflict killed over 200,000 people, and eventually the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and of the United Nations had to step in and try to get Taylor to agree to a ceasefire and a plan to disarm his troops. Taylor won a presidential election in 1997 basically because the Liberians hoped that by electing Taylor he would end the fighting. The peace did not last long, and in 1999 the Second Liberian Civil War broke out. In September 2003, UN peacekeeping forces arrived in Liberia to stabilize the country, leading Taylor to finally step down and flee the country. The UN Peace Forces mission continues today under an American and United Nations security directive known as UNMID. In 2003, they put in place an interim government that was in place until the 2006 election of the country's current president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Over the last 25 years there has been much turmoil, both social and political, in Liberia. The multiple wars left most of the building and infrastructure in a destroyed state. During the civil wars, 200,000 people were killed, 800,000 were displaced from their homes, and 700,000 fled to neighboring countries. Over the last years, Liberia has improved, but it is still unsettled. Liberia is still one of the poorest nations in the world, and there is still significant damage to basic infrastructure. Outside of Monrovia, electricity, running water, sewage and telecommunications are generally limited. Due to the conditions and the spread of Ebola, 4,809 people died in Liberia from Ebola. At this time the UN has declared Liberia provisionally free from Ebola. Overall, the large-scale incidents of violence have tapered off. There is still unrest and issues over economic, religious, ethnic, or social conflicts that rapidly get out of control. The UN military are still on site but spread thin. In Liberia, Christianity is the official and the most widely practiced religion, with about 85% of the population practicing it. The second largest religion in Liberia is Islam, practiced by approximately 12% of the population. There are a few practices of the Baha'i faith, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. At different times there is fighting between Christians and Muslims, sometimes based off an incident and sometimes based off a rumor. The fighting often results in churches or mosques being destroyed. The preamble of the Liberia current charter states, acknowledging our devout gratitude to God for our existence as a free, sovereign and independent state, and relying on His divine guidance for our survival as a nation. Over the last 200 years the United States has had an ever-changing relationship with Liberia, starting as the parent in helping to set up the initial colony, then moving into a role of assistance as Liberia became a republic. As Liberia's economy declined, the US continued to assist Liberia through loans. In the 1920s, US companies, specifically Firestone, began talks with Liberia to acquire a rubber plantation. The agreement was supported by the US government, but it did not favor Liberia. During World War II, the US used Liberia's location to help with military tactics. As the Cold War started, the US signed a mutual defense pact with Liberia for communication. Under US President Kennedy and Liberian President Tubman, the Peace Corps and other assistance programs were established, providing $280 million in aid. After President Tubman died, the relationship with the US started to change. As Dou took over power in Liberia, the US supported him. In the first 5 years of Dou's rule, the US gave $500 million in assistance to Liberia, for which Dou helped the US with military issues. Even though Dou was corrupt, the US's concern over the Cold War with the Soviet kept the US supporting Dou. In 1989, as the Cold War came to an end, the US interest in Liberia faded. Also at this time, Taylor came into power. With the Liberian civil wars occurring, the US removed themselves from assisting Liberia. Since 2003, the US has provided over $1 billion in bilateral assistance to Liberia, US State Department. The US is involved with Liberia on Ebola recovery and development investments, mentoring Liberian security forces, and investing in reconciliation and conflict prevention. To Liberia, the two closest countries are Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast. Back in the 1800s, the relationship with Sierra Leone did not start well, and that has continued over the years. There are officially 16 ethnic groups that make up Liberia's indigenous African population, which totals about 95%. The remaining 5% is made up of America Liberians, who are descendants of freed slaves that arrived in Liberia early in the 1800s. Initially, as the Liberia was settled, the American customs were prominent with the settlers. They spoke English, built colonial-type buildings and houses, and structured a government after the US. They also shared their Christian ideals. As time progressed, the America Liberians mixed with the indigenous tribes through marriage. However, the America Liberians also started to separate themselves almost into classes, begin above the indigenous tribes and making the tribes people equivalent to slaves. When Turdman became president, the tribes were given a greater political voice. As the government upheaval and civil wars continued with the takeover of Doe and then Taylor, the current government structure was overthrown. Based off of all my research and studying, I would say that the African colony for free blacks had good points and bad points. Overall, it was not the best idea the way it was implemented. The colony started off strong, but due to the lack of research about the other cultures and tribes and the attitude of the settlers, it did not continue well. The settlers basically tried to make a black US in the middle of Africa. Once the civil wars started with the takeover of Doe and then of Taylor, the intent of the original goal of Liberia was lost. The one good thing that came from the settling of Liberia was bringing of Christianity to Africa through churches and the education system. Interestingly, there have been other movements in America labeled as back to Africa. None of the movements have ever made it to Liberia. Overall, based on what I read, it looks like Liberia is getting back on track, but it will take a long time.